Hey, what's up, Route 66 travelers? We're at our next rest stop. We're pulling off the highway and taking a break in the book of 1 Samuel. So this past week, we took a look at the first book in the whole volume set of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We looked at 1st Samuel, that transition time that we now see between the time of the judges and now the time of the kings in Israel. We talked about how we're going to investigate the difference between the rejected king and the ideal king. And we looked at the first part, the rejected king, hinted at the ideal king, but focused primarily on the idea of the rejected king. We brought into play through this sports analogy, that concept that there are players and there are coaches, and the players there are starters on a team and there's bench players on a team, and that ultimately they have to follow their coach. And for Israel and for us, our coach is meant to be God. And so that's where we came to our theme for 1 Samuel, is that God may pick you, but he'll bench you if you choose to run your own plays. Now, multiple questions arose in all of this, but the haunting one, the one that we spent really hunkering down and focusing on, that was applied and thought about through the whole process, was this one. Where is your heart? And with that question lingering, we dove into what 1 Samuel had to offer for us. First, we talked about the idea of the major word choice. And we talked about how God himself will choose whom he will to fulfill his purpose. Whether starters or bench, he's going to pick people to do what he wants them to do. Now, we looked at how this applied to Eli and his sons Hophni and Phinehas. See, they didn't follow his rules, did they? No, they decided they wanted to run their own plays. And so in doing so, God made a charge to Eli. He said, hey, wait, didn't I choose you? Didn't I choose your father, your household, your lineage to be the priesthood? I chose you and your sons. I gave you an opportunity, an honor to be in this position. He did the same thing when he talked to Samuel and said, all right, Israel wants a prince to watch over them, a manly king. All right, so he gave him Saul. And so the same thing happened with Saul, though, as is the history of Israel. Screw-ups occurred, and Saul decided, I'm going to run my own plays. He deviated from the plan that God had given him. So then what happens is God then has to bench the starters. And because he does so, then he has to look down the bench to find the next person to put in place. Why does all of this happen? Well, exactly what we said. Because if you run your own plays, God's going to put you on the bench and find somebody that's going to follow his heart. So with Eli and his sons, we saw a very destructive process. God said, I'm pulling the priesthood from your family, Eli. Hophni and Phinehas, they're going to die because of what they've done. Eventually, you're going to die. Your descendants are going to die out. I'm going to pass it on to somebody else. And did the same thing with Saul. He told Samuel, tell Saul, I've taken the kingdom from him. I've taken the throne from him. And so Samuel had to convey that to Saul and say, you're no longer going to be the Lord's anointed. Instead, he's given it to your neighbor, David. Oh, man, that one had to hurt. See, because they never learned the morning phrase. David did eventually learn the morning phrase. He knew the morning phrase. What was the morning phrase? The morning phrase was this, that we hit the ground running each day, our feet at the floor, and we immediately begin to think, I choose God's choice for me, not mine. I choose God's choice for me. It involves a characteristic known as humility. See, and that's what God desires from those who he chooses. When he replaces the starters, it means that he's going to look down the bench and he's going to choose a humble person who has a desire that is in line with his heart. And Samuel's response to this was a great example of this. When God called out to him, finally, when Eli realized what was going on and told Samuel, it's God that's talking to you, then Samuel responded with, your servant hears. Your servant hears. He was already in a place of humility before God. And David, we know David did this. David, when he went before Goliath and the Philistines, he didn't go in the arrogance of his own power. He didn't say, hey, I'm going to take you down. No, he said, I come at you in the name of the Lord of hosts. I come to you in the name of the Lord God Almighty of Israel. It's he who will deliver you into our hands today. See, David then was known as a man after God's own heart. That humility, that respect he had for God's authority, because he had the opportunity to remove Saul and take the throne. But he said, no, Saul is God's anointed until God deems that he will be removed. That was the man after God's own heart. The difference between the rejected king of Saul and the ideal king in David. That rejected king, it chooses their own path selfishly, plays their own game. They're gifted only by their own merits, what they accomplish, and not what God had set forth for them. And then they're only godly in their own mind. They don't actually show it in the actions to everybody else. But that ideal king is chosen directly by the hand of God, is gifted because they accept that what they have comes from God's Spirit, and it's godly by the nature of their heart being lined up with His. And just like David, God's requesting this of us now. Are we going to be that rejected king, or are we going to lean toward the ideal king, which we're going to be able to get into more next week? But we end up back where we started now. And this is where we need to focus as we prepare to move toward this next Sunday is, where is your heart? Do we desire that kind of relationship with God, to truly know God more? Are we willing to seek that heart in the way that David did? The ideal version versus the rejected version. Because you have to remember what it's like to be chosen by God. He doesn't need us, but He wants us. Don't let it become all about you. I don't want it to become all about me. Instead, we focus on that morning phrase that I choose God's choice for me. Hey, keep memorizing those scriptures. Keep going deeper and looking into the application that God has for you as you study with family and friends and on an individual level, and go to prayer before God. And we'll see you this coming Sunday when we step back on the highway and take a look deeper at the ideal king with the book of 2 Samuel. And until then, happy studying.